Alrighty, so our next session is what does it mean to think Orthodox? So, writing the book Thinking Orthodox was very difficult for me. I'm a very kind of concrete person. I write about the Bible and I write about the historical circumstances surrounding the Bible. I'm not into philosophy and thinking about thinking. So it was very difficult for me to come up with words to explain this thought process because we don't usually think about thinking. And this is what we're about to talk about today with the Orthodox mentality. We tend to absorb the concepts, the values in the world around us. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's religious, or a mixture of both. We absorb the thought process as well. So, when we think about how people conceptualize or express or maintain certain values in other parts of the world like China or Saudi Arabia, they have a different way of thinking about things that we take for granted. Well, we might say, yes, men and women are equal. In Saudi Arabia, they'd probably say, no, of course not. That's not true at all. But not only do they have different ideas and thoughts, but they have a different way of arriving at that conclusion. They have a different way of thinking. So if we wish to understand the New Testament, if we wish to be Orthodox Christians, because we are the direct, unbroken continuation of the early church, if we wish to think Orthodox, understand the New Testament, function according to what the fathers of the church, the ancient thinkers of the church thought was good for us, we have to understand the mind of the church. So St. Paul famously said, but we have the mind of Christ. The mind of Christ. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot. Does anybody remember which book he said that in and why he said it? You get extra bonus points and the admiration of your teacher if you know. Everybody's afraid to guess. This isn't Jeopardy. Do you have Jeopardy here? That quiz show where you lose points for wrong guesses? This isn't Jeopardy, so there's no penalty. But anyhow, I'll tell you. It's from 1 Corinthians. Now the Corinthians were arguing with each other. They were quarreling. Isn't that shocking in itself? I mean, the Greeks were quarreling? Who could imagine it? It was just scandalous. So the Greeks were quarreling, and they were quarreling over what? Wisdom versus foolishness. Which group, they had divided into different factions, and this is what Greeks do. They used to argue over philosophy. Today they argue over politics. Oh, by the way, I'll tell you a funny story. One of my friends was visiting Greece, and she went to a little kafenion, a coffee shop, and there was a little platea like the town square, and there were little tables and different colored chairs, and she sat down. Their chairs were red, blue, and green, painted. She sat down in a red chair, and her friend said, "So you're a communist?" She said, "No, I'm not a communist." "Well, you sat in the red chair. So apparently at this kafenion, you sit in the color of your party, the chair of your party." So this is what they do today. They argue over politics. They're arguing always over something. In St. Paul's time, they used to, in the Roman Empire, they argued over philosophy. I'm a Stoic. I'm a Peripatetic. I'm a, Pythagorean. They argued which one was superior. Well, now they're in the church. Now they're arguing over who has the superior wisdom. I am for Paul. I'm for Apollos. I'm for Cephas. I'm for Christ. So Paul has to put an end to that right away and says, you're all wrong because you're thinking about worldly wisdom. But the cross has nothing to do with worldly wisdom. It has nothing to do with human wisdom. The cross is all about the wisdom of Christ, the wisdom of God, which doesn't follow human wisdom. Imagine if you were faced with what God was faced with. How are you going to solve this problem of sin and death? What are you going to do? How are you going to save humanity? Would any one of us say, "Oh, I know. will go and die on a cross. That doesn't even make sense. How are you going to defeat death? We're going to defeat death by dying. That's the wisdom of God. It's beyond human wisdom and understanding. And this is what St. Paul said when he said, we preach Christ crucified. A crucified Messiah? How is that possible? To the Jews, it's a stumbling block, a scandal. And to the Greeks, it's foolishness. But to those of us who believe, Christ is the wisdom of God and the power of God. The cross is the wisdom of God. It makes no sense to the world. This is the reason why the Orthodox Church does not follow the wisdom of this world. So to go back to what we were talking about a moment ago, female deacons or female priests, we don't feel the need to elevate women to the priesthood, to somehow prove that we believe that women are equal to men, and we don't care what anybody else thinks about it. They're following the wisdom of the world. And if you were to say, women are equal to men, yes, that's absolutely true. Women can be just as good priests as men. That's absolutely true. As a matter of fact, they're probably better suited to the priesthood because the priesthood is a caring profession, and women tend to be more empathetic than men. They tend to be more sensitive than men. To be a really good priest, you have to be very sensitive and very empathetic. And women are kind of loaded most of the time with those qualities. So women would be better priests than men. Therefore, so women could make very good priests. Women are equal to men. Therefore, women should be priests. And we'd say no. Because it doesn't matter how logical it is, according to human thinking, that's not what God gave us. That's not what Christ told the church. That's not the tradition of the church. So we don't care if it doesn't comport with human logic. We're going to keep on doing what we've always done because we're following Christ, the mind of Christ. So after explaining why they were wrong about arguing over wisdom and foolishness, Paul is the Corinthians are so proud of themselves because they think they're all very spiritual and they have all this wonderful new wisdom because they've received the Holy Spirit. And he says, we have, speaking about the apostles, but we have the mind of Christ. And he says that to distinguish their mind, which was the mind of the world, versus the mind of Christ. So when we're arguing with each other in church over things like, what we should do, that's not the mind of Christ. So the mind of Christ is the mind of the church. The apostles had the mind of Christ. And the mind of Christ is the mind of the church because the church is the body of Christ. So whether we speak of it as the mind of the church or the mind of Christ, they are the same. So, how did the apostles receive the mind of Christ? They lived with him. They watched him over the course of 3 years. They watched him as he interacted with those scribes and the Pharisees who challenged him. They watched him call up to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, come down. And, coming to your house. They watched him heal the woman who was bent over. They watched him heal the man with a withered hand and respond to the critics. They watched him in all those quiet moments when people just came up to him and must have just they saw the love and the grace of the Lord, and they wanted to just reach out and touch him and experience him and tell him their problems and receive his comfort and his healing. They watched all of that. And they saw how he responded to the Jewish, antagonists that he had. And they slowly acquired his understanding, his behavior, his mentality, and also the Lord shaped them. Sometimes they said or did the wrong thing, and he would rebuke them. Like, Lord, we want you to do whatever we ask. Okay, what is it that you ask? We want to be given a seat, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom. That one, he said, you can't have that. But he's correcting them. Notice when he corrected James and John for that, he brought all the disciples to the discussion. And that's why it says they were indignant with James and John. They wished they'd thought of it first. That's what it comes down to. So he's saying, if any one of you wants to be first, let him be last. So he's teaching them through this. He was teaching them about having the right attitude. On another occasion, James and John, the sons of thunder, some Samaritans were throwing rocks at the disciples, and they said, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them?" And it's just as the Lord rebuked them. Cut it out, guys. Who do you think you are? So you have Peter. Who do men say that I am? Peter says, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Peter is praised for that, right? He's praised. "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you." So, wow, he gets this wonderful praise. And then a few verses later, when Jesus says, "Now that you know that I'm the Messiah, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and be crucified." And Peter says, "Let this not happen, Lord." And what happens? Jesus rebukes him with a very strong rebuke. "Get thee behind me, Satan." Wow. So the Lord both praised the disciples when they thought and did the right thing, and he rebuked them when they were thinking in the wrong way. And by the way, that's the only place in the Gospels where the word Phronema appears in the Gospels. He said to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for you are not thinking as God thinks, but you're thinking as men think." Uphronis, you're not thinking the right way. So this is what they learned from the Lord over their interaction with him over the course of 3 years. And so they learned how to think like Christ. So when they went out after the Pentecost and they established communities, congregations, and they preached the gospel, they established churches everywhere, they taught those people what it meant to be a Christian, how you were supposed to think. And you know what? That wasn't easy, because what the church stood for was opposite or different from everything else in the world. And by the way, it still is. It's supposed to be. We're not supposed to think like the world. So how is it opposite? Just think about what life was like for those first Christians. I'm just so impressed by them. It took so much courage to become a follower of Jesus Christ in those early years. Think of what that meant. Everyone in the world was a pagan, and then there was a small percentage of people who were Jews, and everybody knew who the Jews were, right? They looked different, they behaved different, they stuck to themselves, they didn't intermarry or socialize with the pagans, but the majority of people were pagans. And so the pagan lifestyle was characterized by immorality and idolatry. And that's the majority of the culture. And think about the gods. The gods the pagans worshiped were immoral. They lied and they cheated on their wives and they slept around and this is their gods. Imagine that. Then you had the Jews, and their Jewish religion was nothing like the Greco-Roman religion, but the Jewish religion, they lived by a very strict code of ritual purity and segregation from the rest of society. And that's not what the Christian life was like either. So the Christian teaching was neither like the pagans nor like the Jews, but something completely different. And the values that the Lord taught the disciples, which they passed on to the first Christians, were completely different from the values of the Roman Empire, which, by the way, in many ways it was the same, whether you were Jewish or Roman. Glory and honor. St. Paul talks in the book of Romans about glory and honor, because that's what everybody wanted. They wanted glory and honor. Those were the values of Rome. That's why they built monuments and they liked praise, and it was the same for the Jews too. So this is what people craved, glory and honor. And what happens? Jesus comes along and says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Forgive your enemies. If somebody strikes you on the right cheek, offer him the left. Now, were the Romans teaching those values? Absolutely not. The Romans, are you kidding me? Crush your enemies. What about the Jews? Did the Jews believe in forgiveness of enemies? Do they believe in it today? Of course not. Right? The Christian values were counter to the values of the world then, and they still are. This is why we have to stand firm, stomen kalos. We say in the Divine Liturgy, let us stand aright, let us stand firmly in the faith, let's not waver, let's not quiver, let's not be worried about the fact that other people think we're weird, because we hold to the values of the Christian church. Other Christians will say, oh, that's not right. They've all sold out. Almost all of them have sold out. They've become like the world. There's, I think it's Metropolitan Ierotheas Vlahos, an Orthodox theologian, who said, if the church becomes like the world, it can no longer save the world. I thought that was very profound. It's true. That's why the church always has to be free from the thinking of the world, from following the ways of the world. And so people will say, well, why can't you have gay marriage? Love is love. They just want to love each other. But the church has always considered that a sin. The church cannot condone sin. It doesn't mean we're supposed to persecute them or hate them, but we can't follow the ways of the world. And the same thing with so many other things. So, the Lord gave this phronema, that means mentality, worldview, manner of thinking, to the apostles. He shaped them to have this thinking. And so when the apostles established every little congregation, whether it was in Galilee or then in Samaria, in Antioch, wherever they went, they didn't just teach people facts about Jesus Christ. They didn't just, tell stories and then baptize people and say, that's now you know Jesus, you've been saved, bye-bye, maybe I'll see you again when I pass through town. They didn't do that. They stayed there and they established a congregation and they taught them every day and they tried to shape them and train them. So many of you are, you've been through a lengthy period of education where you had to really learn to think differently. If you're a lawyer like me or like Helena, you have to be trained to think very differently. And by the way, that never leaves you. If you've gone through the medical profession and spent years training as a doctor, you get, a patient comes before you and you just switch into that doctor mode and you go into automatic. If you're an engineer, whatever it is, there's something that comes out of you when you have that training that becomes second nature to you. That's what the apostles instilled in those first Christians. They had to think differently. It wasn't enough to know facts about Jesus Christ or even believe in Jesus Christ. If your thought pattern didn't change, you'd still think like a pagan. You'd still think like a Jew. So they had to change and adopt the thought of Christ. And that's what we see in the fathers of the church and all the Christian fathers. So when did this begin to change? And why do we have a different phronema? The thought process of the early church, the phronema of the early church, is what we see today in the Orthodox Church and only in the Orthodox Church. That is, I gave you the example, say, about women priests. We don't care what reasons you give us, according to human logic, for why women should be priests. I don't care. It's irrelevant. Because we don't make decisions in the church based on human reasoning. We received a tradition from Jesus Christ, and that's what we continue to follow, no matter what. So we have this conversation, sometimes I have these conversations with Catholics about the Pope. Well, obviously, the Pope is the head of the whole church. Jesus made him the rock on which the church is built, and we have this conversation. Look, all I know is this, and they give me all kinds of scriptures and their interpretations. I know them all, and I couldn't care less. It's not persuasive to me, and they don't understand why it's not persuasive to me, because in the Catholic mind, if it makes sense, it is true. Well, here's the Orthodox response. We know how the early church functioned. We know that Peter wasn't the boss of all the apostles. He was the chief, he was the leader, but he didn't tell everybody what to do. By the way, he wasn't even the bishop of Rome. He was an apostle, which was higher than a bishop. But he wasn't in charge of the whole church. He didn't dictate. And even after Peter, the first bishops of Rome, they didn't run the whole church. We know that historically, and even Catholics know that to be true. And so I don't care what reasons you give me for why the Pope should be the head of the whole church of all Christians worldwide. It doesn't matter. It does, because we don't conform to human logic. What we have, what we believe, how we live is only what the early church believed, taught, and lived. And that's why we have a church today. If we compromise that and we're swayed by human reasoning to one thing or the other, then we would lose the church. And that's why the Orthodox are just adamant about preserving apostolic tradition. That's what tradition is for us. It's a preservation of what we received from the apostles. Now, I want to tell you how tradition functions for Protestants. Of course, Protestants, they usually say they're opposed. There's lots of different kinds of Protestants. So it's very difficult to make a generalization about Protestants, and I really shouldn't, but I have to. Protestants generally reject tradition. That's because they came out of the Reformation, right? And in the Reformation, the reformers were protesting against the mistakes, the errors, the abuses of the Catholic Church, and it was pretty corrupt. So when they protested against the extreme power of the Pope and the corruption of the papacy and indulgences and the fact that people weren't supposed to read the Bible in their language, when the reformers protested against that, or they would say, this is not in the Bible, what did the Roman Catholic Church say? They said it's tradition. And that's why tradition became a dirty word for Protestants. They associate tradition with the errors of the Catholic Church. Now, how did the Catholic Church end up in error? Because it was following human wisdom, following human ideas. They ended up dropping the devotion to tradition, preserving the faith that we have, and they followed their own ideas because they gave so much power to the popes. And every pope changed the church a little bit, and it's still happening. That's why the Roman Catholic Church looks nothing like the early church. Their worship is nothing like, their spirituality is nothing like the early church, whereas ours is the same. Our liturgy is the liturgy of the early church. Our lifestyle, our spirituality, our practices are those of the early church. And why is that? Because for us, tradition means we don't change it. For the Roman Catholic Church, they say, well, we have tradition too. We have apostolic tradition. And they believe that. But what they mean by that is this. The Pope is the successor of Peter. All the bishops are the successors of the apostles. So when they make a decision to change something, that is apostolic because they're the successors of the apostles. So when they say something is apostolic, they give it validity because it's coming from Rome. So tradition is a way to change the church for the Roman Catholic Church. You see what I'm trying to say? It's given a sanction. They can legally and morally change anything in the church if it's coming from the bishops, and that kind of makes it apostolic. That's why they say we have apostolic tradition. And if you look at the way they live and how they worship, it's kind of hard to find much apostolic tradition in the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm not saying this to be bashing them or to be super critical, but just so that you understand the difference. When we say tradition, we mean not changing. When they say tradition, it means it can change. And earlier this year, I think it was January 26th, the Pope gave me a present. Here's what it was. I was having this idea about what tradition means for Catholics. I'm trying to wrap my mind around this because they use the word tradition, but they don't mean what we mean by it. And I read this statement from the Vatican that every day, practically, the Pope has visitors. He'll have a papal audience. He gives a little statement to the people who come to see him, and then there's a report. The Vatican office publishes everything the Pope says and everything he does. So on January 26th of 2026, he made a little speech at his daily papal audience about tradition. And he said tradition is something that we preserve from the time of the apostles. And then he goes on to talk about how it can change. That's exactly what the Catholic Church does all the time. They always talk out of both sides of their mouths. They want to preserve something and then have a reason to be allowed to change it. That's very typical for Catholics. So that's the gift that he gave me. So because I printed it out, I said, there it is, right there. That's exactly what I perceived was happening. So he gives all the reasons why tradition is a sacred deposit from the time of the apostles. However, it's part of the life of the church and therefore it can change. Well, if it can be changed, it's not tradition. That's how we see it. They don't see it that way. So I understand. I had lots and lots and lots of all kinds of Christians. I had Christian students, I had Hindu students, Muslim students, Buddhists, atheists. I had them all because I taught for 20 years in a university. So I had all of them. And I had a lot of, very, very devout Protestant, very devout, beautiful Catholic students who really love their church. But they cannot understand why we think so differently, why we won't accept their doctrines, because they spell it all out for us. The scripture says this, and this is interpreted this way. And I'll say, but that's not how the early church interpreted it. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. That's the number one. Well, but that's not how the early church interpreted that verse. It did not mean that Peter was the Pope in charge of the whole church. How do we know that? Because we have the writings of the fathers of the church. Not only Chrysostom, but St. Augustine says what it means. The rock, on this rock I will build my church, is Christ. It's the word Petra. Later in the New Testament, Peter, in his own epistle, 1 Peter, talks about Jesus as the stone, lithos, of scandal, and the rock of the church, Petra. So we know how the early church interpreted those scriptures. So I don't care if you give me a stack of arguments a mile high. It's irrelevant to us. They are so frustrated by us, you can't believe it. And this has been going on for hundreds of years, by the way. And Catholic writers will say, we explained everything to those Greeks, and they just won't listen to reason. They're irrational. That's what they said. They call us irrational because we don't accept their argumentation. I see your point. You don't see my point. We don't give a damn, like Rhett Butler said to Scarlett O'Hara. Frankly, my dear, doesn't matter. I don't care about your human reasons. I hope nobody was offended by the use of the word damn. My mother told me she went to see Gone with the Wind. I think she was 21 years old. It came out in 1939. She was born in 1918. And she told me, because that's such a famous novel and famous movie, and it ends that way with Rhett. In case you don't know, I don't know anybody here doesn't know the story. So Rhett Butler is the main male character. He's leaving his wife. He's kind of disgusted with her behavior. And she says, she's from the South, "Oh, Rhett, where will I go? What will I do?" And he says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." My mother said that in the movie theaters, people gasped because Clark Gable said, "Damn." Just think how far we've come, dear people, how far we've come. Think how far we have come. I'm getting off topic here, but this is fun. Okay, so I want to talk about what Phronema is. What is Phronema? St. Paul uses this word a lot. And he talks about how we have to have the mind of the church and the mind of Christ, which is not the mind of the world, it's not the mind of the flesh. So he says in Romans chapter 8, "For those who are according to the flesh have their minds on, phronusin, the things of the flesh. But those who are according to the Spirit on the things of the Spirit. For the mindset, phronema, of the flesh is death, but the phronema of the Spirit is life and peace. For the phronema of the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, for it cannot." So you see, There was a certain mentality that Christians were expected to follow, to not be of the flesh, to not be of the world, to have the mind of Christ. And this is how they were shaped by the apostles. It was as essential as anything. And this is how they learned. And this is what we have preserved in the Orthodox faith. It's extremely important that we have preserved this because of this. What is the essence of orthodoxy? What does it mean to be Orthodox? It means that we've preserved the ancient tradition without changing it. That's who we are. What does it mean to be a Catholic? What is the absolute essential thing you have to be a Roman Catholic? Allegiance to the Pope. You recognize that the Pope is the head of your church. That's what it is. That's essential to be a Catholic. If you don't recognize the Pope as the head of the church, it doesn't matter what else you believe. I'm not saying that that's all there is to being a Catholic. But if you're to be a Roman Catholic, means you recognize the Pope as the head of your church. Otherwise, you're not Catholic, right? What is the essential thing you have to follow or believe to be a Protestant? What is the most important thing? Sola scriptura. You believe that the scriptures alone have authority. If you don't believe that, you're just not a Protestant, right? That's it. What is our essential belief? Preservation of apostolic tradition. I'm getting this, trying to bring this home to you and make it very direct so that you can understand that as soon as we begin to compromise the faith, we are no longer Orthodox. And so if somebody says, because somebody told me last night that she was in some kind of email communication with this so-called Orthodox theologian who I happen to know, who's a woman who's advocating for gay marriage and women priests and all the rest, I said, just tell her she's not Orthodox. You've cut up your Orthodox card. Because as soon as we change, because we don't not keeping tradition, essentially we stop being Orthodox. That's like telling the Catholic, if a Catholic person says, I don't recognize the Pope, well, guess what? You're not Catholic. If a Protestant says, I don't believe the Bible is the authority, well, you're not a Protestant. So as an Orthodox Christian, as soon as you say we don't need to follow tradition, you're just not Orthodox. So that's why it's so important. When other people say to us, well, why don't you just change this? And why don't you just change that? And do this and do that. Say to the Protestant, why don't you give up the Bible? When you give up the Bible, I'll change. Say to the Catholic, why don't you give up the Pope? Give up the Pope. Stop being who you are. And I'll respect that. Then you can tell me to change. We cannot give up who we are to accommodate the world because you know what? As soon as we do, then they'll want something else and something else and something else and something else. And as a church, you can't imagine, I got to tell you, the Roman Catholics have a wide variety of beliefs. They have super liberal theologians who don't even believe that Jesus rose from the dead, things like this. You got super conservative theologians who want to go back to the Latin Mass and that sort of thing. You got everything in between, but they're united under one thing, the Pope. The Pope is the vehicle by which the Roman Catholic Church maintains its unity. We don't have a Pope. So as soon as we start to go off and give up and start following other ways and following our own ideas and changing the church here and there, Father was to say, on Sunday, listen, I've got my own ideas. We're going to start doing this here. As soon as that happens, if every other priest and bishop starts to do the same, we will become exactly like the Protestants. Thousands of different kinds of orthodoxy. We can't do that. That's why we must preserve apostolic tradition. What we have is better than anyone else has. Protestants forget about it. There's no unity. They know there's a problem in Protestantism, that there's no unity, and they try to say, well, the church is invisible. The church kind of exists. Well, nobody ever talks about an invisible church. When did Jesus or the apostles ever talk about an invisible church? But they can't explain their disunity. And so for us, the unity is in the faith that we all share, and the shared divine liturgy. It's the way we worship. It's what we believe. It's all the same no matter where you go. There's some little differences. in the Russian churches, women tend to cover their heads. In the Greeks, they don't. Some churches have a more low iconostasy. Others are more flowery, more, those are unimportant things. But in terms of our doctrine and our worship, we are the same everywhere in the world, and we haven't changed since the era of the early church. So we have to remember that we are not to accept practices and compromise things, even when it seems to make sense. Okay, so people will try to sway you and say, yeah, but that doesn't make sense. Why can't we do this? We just change this one little thing. Okay, and then the rest falls apart, because as soon as you change the one thing, people will say, well, you changed that. Why don't you change this? And why don't you change this? So we have to recognize that there is a certain, what makes us Orthodox and what unites us is the unity of the faith. We say this in the Divine Liturgy, having prayed for the unity of the faith, right? That's what we believe in. This is what we have. And this is why people are coming to the Orthodox Church, because we're not changing with the whims of society and culture. Now, some people say, well, shouldn't you modernize? Well, here's the problem with that. Every generation is living in modern times. Just think about it. In ancient Rome, when the church began, they weren't saying, we're living in ancient Rome. Of course, that's stupid. They were living in modern times. It was modern for them. In the 12th century, these are modern times. In the 15th century, we're modern. We got the printing press. Yay, modern technology. Every generation lived in modern times. It was their contemporary experience. So if we're going to modernize, the church will be constantly changing. And what has happened to so many of you probably came from this experience. You go to church one day and this is how it is, and then next week the pastor wants to do something else and he just changes everything. And then you're stuck looking for another church, and you want a church that doesn't change. Well, there's a reason why we don't change, and it's not because we're stubborn. It's because we're devoted to preserving what the Lord gave the apostles. That's it. Case closed, okay? So we don't care about what other people say. Leap on. So we have to remember that this is what it is. I forgot what questions was I supposed to answer in this rant. I'm sorry, dear people. Apostolic tradition and apostolic writings. Session 2. Sorry about that. So the modern method, the modern thought is you follow your own mind and your own opinions. That's modern. We're kind of trained that way. And by the way, when I say we don't use human reasoning, this is how the West changed from the East. They adopted human reasoning as a basis for theological decisions and moral decisions, by the way. So I've had people say to me, but I have to use human reasoning. I'm a physician. I said, by all means, please use human reasoning. We're not saying to be irrational. We're talking about in the church. In the church. So let's say you're a physician, you're an engineer, you're a teacher, you're a plumber, you're using your brain. God gave us human reasoning, yes, to function in the world. We're supposed to use our human reasoning to avoid sin. But when you set foot inside the church, you leave your reasoning outside and you listen to what the church says, not come up with your own reasons for why things should change. You see? That's what happens. We think that because we're capable and we're adults and we're mature and we're experts at whatever we do, everybody here has a phenomenal expertise in one or more areas. But that doesn't mean that your opinion about what we should teach or believe or practice matters in the church. It doesn't. Instead, what we do is we conform ourselves to the church. Now, this is another way that we're very different from the West. So in the Protestant world, if you don't like, what's happening in your church, you just go to another church. They go church shopping, right? Or better yet, start your own church, right? And then in the Roman Catholic Church, you know what's happening there? A few years ago, Pope Francis, knowing, you see that there's a problem with the Catholics. They know they have a super hierarchical structure with a pope on the top, right? No question about that. Bishops, and then kind of comes down to the people. And they know that in the early church, everything was done by synods, by church councils. We still do that today. We have church councils. We decide everything together. In the early church, there was no pope. There was a bishop of Rome, but there wasn't one person in charge of everything. So everything was decided as a group. So they know that, and they try to work that in. So there are councils. There's probably a Council of Catholic Bishops for Australia. There's a U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And they say, oh, we have councils. We have conferences of our bishops. They decide things together, but they actually don't, because it has to be approved by the Pope. Okay, when we have conferences or synods or councils, whatever the council decides, that's it. Doesn't have to get approved by anybody. And all the bishops have, by the way, just one vote. And no bishop has a veto power over any other bishop. They all have to come to an agreement. You know how hard that is? Especially with the Greeks. Probably the Antiochians too, because the Arabs are a lot like the Greeks. You understand what I'm saying? This is really the Holy Spirit at work in the church. It's a lot more difficult, but it's better because the church is forced to reach a consensus. And we don't have any one person who has the ability to take the church in an entirely different direction, which is exactly what happened to the Roman Catholic Church, and that's why they're so different from us today. They can't see that, but it's their structure that allows this. So in the church, I started to tell you, Pope Francis, a few years ago, knowing that there needs to be more involvement by lay people, there needs to be more councils, he called for a special synod. It's called the Synod on Synodality. I don't know if you heard about it. Okay, they were meeting every fall for 3 years. This is a council about having councils. And they invited people, including lay people, to come. But before they actually met in Rome, in their individual parishes, they were supposed to have meetings and ask the people, what do you want from the church? And I was still teaching at the university back then. This was like, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I heard that they were going to have this council, the Synod on Synodality, and they were going to start meeting in the local Roman Catholic parishes, asking people what they wanted from the church. And I was horrified by that. Are you kidding me? You're going to ask the people what they want from the church? Do you know what a big problem this is? They're really opening a big can of worms. Oh, we want gay marriage. We want women priests. We want this and we want that. We want, So this is what they did. They had little regional meetings, and then people went to Rome to talk about what they wanted from the church. I can't tell you how completely opposite that is from what we think in the Orthodox Church. We know that we're supposed to conform ourselves to the church. We're not supposed to tell the church how it has to change for us. Can you see how opposite that is? Can you see how we can never have a union with the Roman Catholic Church? Their thinking is the polar opposite of what we believe. There's no consistency. The early church, you joined the church to join the church, not to make it into whatever you want it to be, to satisfy your own desires, your own opinions. I've had conversations with Roman Catholic theologians who are so critical of their church. I mean, very few Catholics are completely happy with their church. I'm sorry to say, I don't mean to be bashing the church. I'm just trying to share with you so that you know, if you haven't been part of that world or interacted with that world, you have no idea what's going on. Most Roman Catholics want their church to change somehow, and they're encouraged. That's because of that thinking. The church should be responsive to us. So a lot of them want the church to go back to being more conservative. And others want it to become even more liberal. But almost everybody's unhappy in some way or the other. And we don't have that problem in Orthodoxy because we're saying, listen, this is who we are. Join us if you want to be like this or follow this path. Otherwise, we're not for you. But we don't try to be all things to all people. And we don't try to make people happy. And instead, I've had so many Catholic colleagues, and they were complaining so much. And I said, why are you Catholic? And they said, because I'm going to change the church. They're on a mission to change the church. We have a few like that in the Orthodox Church. That's not Orthodox. They have no business calling themselves Orthodox Christians. They don't represent the Phronema of the church. So, at any rate, I've talked too long again. I'm sorry. I don't even know if I covered everything I was supposed to, but I want to give you an idea of what it means to have the mind of the church. How do we acquire the mind of the church? It's through attending the church services, participating in the sacraments, reading the fathers of the church, reading the lives of the saints. These things shape our minds in a very profound manner. You know, you read the lives of the saints and you think, wow, this is who we're called to be. And we might not reach that level of spiritual achievement, but we're supposed to strive for it. So this is how we acquire the mind of Christ. Read the scriptures, read the lives of the saints, etc. And I'm going to stop here so I don't go over and let y'all ask your questions or make your comments. Yes, go ahead.
So thank you once again, Dr. Jeannie. As you mentioned in your talk, the Orthodox Church emphasizes a degree of unity grounded in apostolic tradition and the consensus of the church hierarchy that wouldn't be present in many other denominations.
Right.
But there always have been opposing theological currents within the church. For example, the Council of Nicaea was convened precisely because the heresy of Arianism was becoming so popular. And when it comes to today, the main example that I can think of is ecumenism.
Yes.
So when I look at the letters written by the monks of Mount Athos, for example, I see an extremely critical perspective when it comes to the practices of ecumenism. But then when we look at our ecumenical patriarch who prays alongside the Pope, obviously there's a distinct sentiment present there. So especially as lay people, how would we navigate that when we see distinct members of the church hierarchy acting in contrary ways to each other? Yes.
First of all, the question is, what do you mean by ecumenism? So it seems to me that when this is being discussed, especially here, I have to tell you, it's not an issue in the United States. But ecumenism, that word is being used. I don't mean because it's accepted in the United States, but the word is being used to mean dialogue with other churches or friendly relations. That's not ecumenism. Ecumenism, to my understanding, is compromise with another faith to get along with them. I don't see us doing that. And I know that the ecumenical patriarch tries to have a good relationship with the Bishop of Rome. That's not ecumenism, okay? We don't have to be nasty to each other. We are fellow Christians, and they have something, and it's good for us to have good relationships with other Christian churches, as long as we don't compromise the faith. So they might say a prayer together. Actually, that's really not, to my understanding, contrary to the canons of the church. They can't liturgize together. They've been present. Bartholomew went to the elevation of the consecration. Was it Francis or was it Leo? I can't remember. He attended, but he didn't participate liturgically. So whether or not that violates the norm, I'm a lay person, I'm a faithful Orthodox Christian, I'm not going to criticize my patriarch, okay? Because that's not my place. So I think that we have to remember that in the Orthodox Church, look, one of the things that's very characteristic of us Orthodox is that we love the church, we love the faith, and we want to preserve it. I'm all for that. But then that becomes this attitude like, I'm going to point out everything that's wrong in the church. I'm going to condemn this bishop for saying that or doing this or doing that. You're not covering your head, therefore you're not a good Orthodox Christian. We have to be careful that in our zeal to preserve the faith, we don't fall into judgmentalism of other Orthodox Christians. We're very good at that. That's our worst characteristic, in my opinion. We judge other Orthodox and their degree of orthodoxy. We all have our standard, and we're the best, and we know better than everybody else. When it comes to the hierarchs, they have a role to play in the church. If the ecumenical patriarch or any other bishop steps out of line, believe me, the other bishops let him know. Now, the difference between us and the Roman Catholics is we keep our dirty laundry inside, okay? Because I've had occasion where people say, well, what about this bishop? He said or did this. And I was talking in front of a bishop. I was giving a talk, and the bishop was there, and I said, listen, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, okay? And the other bishops handle it. They say to him, hey, what was that thing that you did? What was that thing that you said? Don't do that anymore. They police each other. And that goes for the ecumenical patriarch, too. He's not a pope. He can't just do whatever he wants. So there may be people who disagree with that, and they want to take a harder stance, and definitely the monastics will take a harder stance. I'm not in a position where I feel like I'm in a position to criticize the patriarch, all right? He's doing what he thinks is right. As far as I can see, he's being friendly to the Bishop of Rome. I don't think there's a problem. We don't have to be hostile. If he were to do something else and compromise the faith, and they are talking about one thing, they're talking about having a common date for Easter, that's something different. Because now you're violating one of the canons of an ecumenical council. Unless the Catholics can join us and have Easter in May, that's fine, but we're not going to change. I think the patriarch is smart enough to know that if he did that, there would be an upheaval in the Orthodox world. That's where we, as the faithful, have a lot of power, because we can hold hierarchs accountable to preserving the faith. But criticizing them for decisions, a lot of times we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and sometimes there are reasons that they do things. But I'm not too concerned about that. But I understand. Listen, I'm not worried about the Orthodox Church. What I'm saying, especially with all the converts, all you people coming in, you're going to be very strong about preserving the faith. What we don't want to do is be proud and think, I'm like Mark of Ephesus. I'm going to save the church. I'm going to point out all the errors of this person and this hierarch and that priest. Get off of your, don't be so full of yourself. That's a position of pride. The church already had people like Athanasius and Mark of Ephesus who preserved the church from going into error. We're not in that situation. So we have to have some humility and trust that our bishops will do the right thing. If the day comes when they are advocating things like gay marriage, that's when we step up and scream and holler and that sort of thing. But if they're just being nicey nice to each other, I think that that's appropriate for Christians. Wouldn't Jesus say that? I mean, they're not even our enemies. We're supposed to pray and, supposed to love them. So, and also because it's important that even ecumenical dialogues, in the 70s, that's when this was big. So this is why I'm saying this is not really an issue in the United States. Ecumenism was a big issue in the United States in the 1970s. Orthodox theologians, everybody was afraid that they were going to sell out the church. But really famous Orthodox theologians went to these talks, like Meyendorff, and Florovsky. They were part of these big, high-level, worldwide commissions where they were engaged in ecumenical dialogue, and they realized it was pointless. Now, why did they go? Not to compromise the faith, but to express the Orthodox faith to those other churches. But they found out the other churches weren't interested, or they didn't understand us because they didn't have the Phronema. So I'm not worried about us. As long as I'm worried about the liberal Orthodox who are pushing things. But I'm not too worried about the hierarchs. I don't really see that as a problem. Thank you. Long answer for a short question. Sorry. Let's go ahead.
Sorry, this is, I think, sort of in the same vein. The reading for today in the epistle was from the first letter of Corinthians, chapter 11. And it said, "For in the first place, when you assemble as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it, for there must be factions among you, in order that those who are genuine among you be recognised." Can you explain that? I was a bit confused as to why there must be a division or factions or people thinking differently.
That's 1 Corinthians 11. So that's where he's discussing worship. And why he says, I don't want to put you off, but I'd have to look at the Greek and take a look at the whole context to see why he's saying that some of you might be recognized. I don't know what he's getting at there. There he's talking in 1 Corinthians 11, that's where he talks about women showing modesty and covering their heads when they prophesy. He talks about them not getting drunk at the services. He talks about being reverent, not talking in church. He gives the words of Christ and he talks about how if you receive the body and blood of the Lord unworthily, you could get sick or die. That's a whole section about worship. So offhand, I can't answer the question, and I don't want to attempt to give it because it wouldn't be right. So I'm sorry. Maybe if you have the Greek scriptures, we could look at it if we have time. Somebody else, you had a question? Yes, go ahead.
Just for young men, like one of the most challenging verses is if someone hits you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering what your answer is for the Orthodox mindset towards self-defense.
A saint would not respond. A saint would not strike back. Self-defense. So, we in the world feel like, and I'll have to tell you just for myself, I can see myself defending another person, but I hope that I would not defend myself. I think that there is something to be said for defending in defense of others who are innocent. I think that's different from self-defense. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to allow yourself to be beaten up or something like this, but this is a moral question. And there's really no one-size-fits-all answer because there have been times when the church has allowed that and has even sanctioned war, right? The Greek War of Independence. The church was involved in that. So there is no hard and fast rule. But when it comes to church, like Chrysostom, I'll tell you what he said. Chrysostom was the ultimate pacifist. I don't know that pacifism, pure pacifism, is really, we could say, realistic in this world. Otherwise, we'd all be flying the Nazi flag, right? So I understand that, but Chrysostom said this. He said, Jesus conquered not by killing, but by dying. So he believes in complete pacifism and not resisting evil. For those of us who live in the world from a practical perspective, I don't know that that's really realistic. But it depends on what are you talking about? Karate? Yeah, is that what it is? Or are you talking about being a police officer and defending the innocent? What do you mean by that? A lot of converts coming in and wondering how to behave. Listen, the more we model Christ, the more Christ-like we become. That's what we're supposed to be. We're not supposed to retaliate. That's what it says. That's what the Lord said. And when he was struck, what did he say to the servant of the high priest? If I have spoken wrong, testify to the wrong. If I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? St. Paul gathered a legion of Roman soldiers to defend him from the Jews? But how to defend him? St. Paul didn't do that. St. Paul, you're talking about St. Paul when he was arrested in arrested in Jerusalem. He didn't gather a legion of Roman soldiers. They came. The Jews were about to destroy him and kill him, and the Roman soldiers came and saved him, and they took him to Caesarea Maritima. Paul just said, whatever happens, happens, right? He didn't do that. Anyhow, he didn't fight. He didn't strike people back. He was beaten. He didn't inflict blows. So this is a very difficult question. I don't think we're here to judge people's choices. That's a question for you to ask your spiritual father. It's an individual thing. And I'm just saying that the saints don't retaliate, and that's what makes them saints. So if that's what we want, that's how we're going to live. Anybody else? Who else we got here? Other questions? Yes, over here, this young man. Okay. We're out of time. Over here, and then over. Okay, we're going to take. I'll try to answer fast. You
Thank
should
for
put me on
that.
a timer. Yes, sir.
You speak a lot against Catholics and Protestants, which is great.
I'm speaking against the teachings of their
Yes.
church.
I know.
Because I'm going to tell you, I've had amazing students who literally my jaw dropped when I heard the things that they did, Catholics and Protestants. Okay, I'm going to let you ask your question, then I'll tell you a couple of stories. Go.
Yes, no, I was just going to say, personally speaking, here in Melbourne, a lot of people I come across, I'm actually happy when I find someone who takes their Catholic or Protestant faith seriously. Personally, I just
Yes.
find people just don't care about
Absolutely.
religion. You mentioned last night at Northgate the quote from Revelation about people are lukewarm. So what's your advice when coming across lukewarm people? Because most people I just find just are indifferent to Christ. They just don't care.
Yes,
in
they
Melbourne.
don't care. What do we do for people who are indifferent to Christ? I don't know how we appeal to them. I would just look in the early church, this is how people became Christians. Think about this, which, by the way, their culture was not that different from ours in the Roman world, right? Very godless, very hedonistic. Why did people join the church? Because they saw people loving their enemies, helping other people. They saw them joyful. They saw them in the arenas being tortured to death and dying cheerfully. And they said, what's with these people? I want what they have. When we live as true Christians, people will be drawn to us and they'll want to know, what is it that you have? What is the reason for your cause of joy? Give the testimony for what it is that you have. So I think we just are called to live our lives. If somebody is, and then you minister to people in terms of their need. You don't have to preach at them. I see that you're sad. What's wrong? Would you like, maybe you should consider that Jesus Christ is somebody you can turn to. There are people who are willing to believe and open to faith if people talk to them. But I think we have to be very careful how we approach that. And sometimes a person might show no interest, but really they're hungry for something. Or sometimes they might reject it, but later they remembered what you said. And there's a third thing you can do. Say, would you like to come to church with me? Just, no strings attached. It's kind of interesting. You might find it interesting. It's the worship of the early church. We could go to coffee afterwards or whatever. You know how many people have become Orthodox just because somebody invited them to church? There you go. Okay, I'm going to tell you one quick story. There was this Roman Catholic student of mine. She had to take a course at 1 o'clock that was about Christology. And the professor, I'm sorry to say this, but it's true, so much of what's happening in the universities, they're not even Christian. They're teaching heresy. So this was a Roman Catholic professor. Everybody knew she's teaching Christology, and what she was teaching was heresy. And this poor girl was so devout, beautiful Irish girl. She asked me to write a recommendation for her to go to a graduate school in Ireland. She said, it's so hard for me to deal with this professor's class. I said, well, how do you handle it? Because this is a person of faith that has to go to class and listen to a professor talk about how Jesus Christ really isn't God and this kind of a thing, a Catholic professor. So I said, what do you do? She said, because her class was at 1 p.m., she said, I go to Mass at 12. Every day they had a Mass in the chapel at 12. I go to Mass at 12. I go to class and listen to this nonsense. And then I go and find a church that is having the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament and I pray. I said, wow. She sandwiched this blasphemy with a couple hours of prayer. That's how she dealt with it. When I'm telling you, I'm not bashing Catholics and Protestants. I'm telling you that there are a lot of godly people and they put us to shame. I'm going to give you another story because I want to hear these questions. But this is really worth hearing. My son is getting married to an evangelical Protestant. He found this lovely girl. There's not too many Greeks in San Diego. Goes to church every Sunday. Didn't meet somebody, but happened to meet this girl who's a very devout Christian, but she's an evangelical. Her sister got married last week, and we went to the wedding. And, of course, they did the usual vows. They talk to each other and give their vows. And, you could say, well, that's nothing compared to the Orthodox wedding ceremony. That's true. where you're consecrated to Christ and you stand before the altar in this sacred space. But at the reception afterwards, in all the speeches, because this couple is devout evangelical Christians and they met at their church, all the speeches afterwards, the people who were talking about the couple and Jesus Christ. And I ask you, for those of you who are Greeks, when was the last time you went to a wedding reception and everybody was talking about Christ? They put us to shame, I'm telling you. So I'm here to talk about what's wrong with the teachings of their churches, not with the people, many of whom really put us to shame. We could learn from them, and many of them come from the evangelical culture where they're not afraid to talk about Jesus Christ. And we're like, well, I don't know, good for them. Good for them for talking about Christ. So we have a lot to learn from our brothers and sisters. That's why we shouldn't be critical of the patriarch talking to the Pope or praying with the Pope. God forbid we should be afraid to pray with anybody. Go ahead.
Hi. My question is, so you said we don't solve disagreements through logic, but how did the early church?
Yes.
How did the early church decide which interpretation to follow? Or
that's a very good question. Well, how did the early church decide which interpretation to follow? They didn't use human reasoning. Because if you want to use human reasoning, you can't believe in the Trinity. That makes no sense. You can't believe that the Son of God became a human being. Why would God become a human being and die on a cross? Does that make logical sense? It doesn't. So how did they decide? They followed what the church had always taught. Heresies was a departure from what the church always taught. The church knew from the beginning, the apostles knew that Jesus Christ was both human and divine. That's what they clung to. So if a heretic came along and said, no, he's not fully divine like Arius did, the fathers of the church knew that was incorrect. They just had to find the way, the language to explain why it was wrong. But they didn't rely on human reasoning, because if you really think about it from a human perspective, that does not make sense. That's why it was hard for people to become a Christian. How could you possibly believe that God, think about what they thought about gods. Don't think about what you think about God. God is love. God made the world, blah, blah, blah. That's not the gods of the Roman Empire. The gods of the Roman Empire are the gods of Olympus. They're fornicating. They're committing adultery. They're getting drunk. They're not going to become a human being and die on a cross. So as far as the Romans were concerned, that was irrational. The Christian faith was irrational. So how did the church decide? We use our human reasoning, but not to arrive at theological conclusions that contradict what the church has always taught. We don't use our human reasoning to change the moral teachings of the church. Because you know what? We use our human reasoning to get ourselves into sin, don't we? We use our human reasoning to justify our sin. That's what Eve did in the garden. Eve explained everything properly to the serpent. She says, God gave us all these trees. We can eat from all the fruit of the garden. And then the serpent said, but God doesn't want you to eat this one because you'll be just like him. And she started to think about that. Said, that kind of makes sense. And then she saw the fruit, and it was beautiful and good to eat. So she ate it. She talked herself into sin by using her human reasoning. So the reasoning isn't always good. It can lead us to sin. How do we avoid that? We stay faithful to the teachings of the church despite our human reasoning that says, but I love my girlfriend. She doesn't want to get married. We'll just live together. That's human reasoning. That takes us to hell. So why did God give us human reasoning? By the way, we're supposed to be rational. We're supposed to use our human reasoning. The fathers of the church, the prayers call us the reason-endowed sheep of Christ, because we're not supposed to be like animals that don't use reasoning. We're supposed to use our human reasoning to avoid sin, not to follow the impulses of our animalistic nature, because we're creatures and we have impulses. Like somebody hits me, I want to hit him back. A cute girl winks at you at the end of the bar. You're married, but you say, hey, but my wife doesn't know, won't hurt her. I'm away on a business trip. She'll never find out. That's human reasoning. Take us straight to hell. See what I'm trying to say? We use human reasoning. God gave us our reasoning to imitate God, not to find excuses to change what we received from God in terms of the tradition of the church. One more question. I'm sorry I'm giving you these long answers. It was over here was Helena who had the last question.
Thank you.
You can talk to me at the break. Helena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeannie. What a wonderful afternoon we've had here today. You've given us so much to think about and to go away and discuss. My question is related to what we've been talking about, and that is about Christian apologetics. So could you please explain to us what would be the Orthodox way of approaching Christian apologetics? Do we have an Orthodox apologetics way of speaking about God?
I think that what we do is, I think because the world does not understand our Phronema, which is preservation of apostolic tradition, not following human reasoning, that if we want people to understand how we think, we should just say that we are the original church. We have preserved exactly what Christ gave the apostles without changing it. And that's why we don't follow other opinions, whether it's John Calvin or Martin Luther or the Prime Minister or the LGBTQ community. That's what I think we need to start telling people. This is who we are, and we're like this because we have preserved what Christ gave the apostles. Don't just say apostolic, say Christ gave these teachings to the apostles. And I'll tell you how there's one thing you might say to them. When Christ was on the top of the high mountain and he said to his apostles, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. Where is that written down? He doesn't say, here guys, I wrote this book for you, drop it down as he is ascending into heaven, figure it out for yourselves, you got the Bible. He left them a body of oral instruction. That's what we have preserved in the Orthodox Church. And there are ways that I could prove it, but we're out of time. Okay, let's take a break.